I'd like to welcome everybody to the Setzler Subcommittee of Judiciary Non-Civil. We've got a hearing today on the docket. We've got two bills that have been identified. We're going to take up Senate Bill 591 first today. And I do believe there's a chance that because we're going to take a deep dive in 591, we may not have time for 328 today. So we will ensure that 328 has adequate time to make it through the process, should that be the will of the subcommittee and committee. So if you're here for 328, it's going to be second. It's going to be a while, and if we run out of time, there's a full committee meeting today at 3. So we're not going to cut 591 short to move to 328. So I wanted to just say that in advance. If that helps you plan what you're doing this afternoon, I wanted to be very clear up front. But with that, Chair, I'd like to recognize Senator Hatchett for Senate Bill 591. And grab the podium. I know there's going to be some folks that are going to try to join in by Zoom. I'm going to let you present the bill, kind of talk through the issues, and if there's some folks you want to have speak with you as part of your presentation, you've got the ability to do that, and we'll have a sign-up list.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator.
I appreciate the time today. We're talking about Senate Bill 591, LC number SB 591 CSFA, as passed by the Senate. And I want to kind of go back to the origin of this bill and how we got to where we are. In my district, we have several recycling facilities. I actually got to tour one of the facilities and spend a considerable amount of time there watching people bring in scrap metal. One of the things that was very consistent throughout the day was that people would bring in various amounts of metal, and a lot of times it'd be, it would be worth $12, for example. Well, right now, the way the law is written is that recycler would not be allowed to give that person cash for the metal that they sold. They would have to actually give them a check. And I don't know if you know a whole lot about Northeast Georgia. Some people don't trust the government or banks, and they operate with cash. And so if you don't have a bank account and you have a check in your hand, it costs anywhere from $5 to $8 to get that cash or that check cash. So someone would get a $12 check, and then it costs them $8 to cash it. So it's kind of a burden on on my constituents, number one. Number two, it's costing these recycling facilities an average of about $5 per check that they have to write. And so that's kind of the inception of the bill. I spoke with one of the owners of a recycling facility in Toccoa, Georgia, and he approached me and thought about, well, how can we get rid of this, cash, or how can we get rid of this check mandate? And so, I've been working with him for a little over a year now. We came up with the idea that cash would be allowed if it's under a certain amount. The fair amount that we've agreed to this session is $100. So if it's under $100, you can give cash for the metal that they sell. And I'll tell you, when I first threw this idea around, I was approached by a couple people, and I had to do a little bit of homework because I understand now that back in 2012, there was a huge movement to strengthen the metal theft laws in the state of Georgia. And there were shopping carts of metal that would come into the chambers, and there was a huge lobbying effort. And what that did, and as a result of that bill, I know metal theft has decreased dramatically, but one of the, some of the requirements that I witnessed when I was at these metal recycling facilities is you got to take their picture. You got to take their picture with the stuff. You have to get their ID. You get so much information about people that I think if you're talking about a deterrent, I don't think the check is what's deterring the metal theft. I think the having to video them and take their picture and get all their information and get their ID and everything, I think that's the main deterrent. And we don't in any way want to soften the metal theft statute. And so when we first started out at the beginning of this session, we called a meeting and kind of put an email out to anybody that would be interested. In the very first meeting we had 30 different groups at least represented. And so we've worked for almost 2 months now with everyone who we thought would be involved. It's been in the hopper. It's everybody that needed an opportunity to chime in has, and I think we're at a point now where we've got the cash piece where it needs to be, but along the way we've picked up some, I think, positive changes to the metal theft statute, including harsher penalties for possession of used catalytic converters. And I think unintentionally, this is very ripe right now because just this past weekend there's been a lot of reports about catalytic converter theft in several neighborhoods around here and across the state. So, this will strengthen the metal theft statute when it comes to catalytic converters. But then also, one of the most important pieces of this legislation, I think, is when we decided to do the cash piece, obviously there was some negotiations there as to what would be fair, and we looked at some of the most commonly stolen metals. So catalytic converters, air conditioning coils, and utility wire, copper wire. And what we did was we had a carve out to where you cannot get cash for exchanging catalytic converters, air conditioning coils, or any of that utility grade copper wire. And so that just is a show of good faith that we are not trying to make it easier for people to steal. What we're trying to do is make it easier on the consumer and make it easier and more cost effective for these recyclers. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Sure. Before we do that, do you want to walk us through the bill in detail? Can we kind of go line by line at this point, or is there anybody else you want to speak broadly for you before we take that deep dive?
Well, I think there are a few people that we brought. I have someone on Zoom right now who actually owns and operates or her family owns and operates a recycling facility, and then there are several in the audience that are going to testify. And I'd like to, if we can get their input first, just to kind of get the broad picture and where we come from a policy standpoint, then I'd be happy to, if it's okay with the chairman, then walk through.
Before we take that deep dive, I'm going to recognize Representative McLaurin. You did have a question. Anything generally?
I defer to the chairman's path through the hearing.
Okay. Okay. So if you want to recognize the folks to speak sort of in tandem with you, if they're online,
Yeah.
Senator, I'll let you recognize them now.
It's Brian Hudson who has helped me throughout this process bring all the people together that would have an interest. He's here and
because we do have a sign-up list, but if folks are here at your behest, I want to make sure you can kind of organize them as you would.
Yeah,
so if you want Mr. Hudson or somebody online, it's your pleasure.
I'd like for him to go first. Thank you.
Yep, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator. Appreciate it. So if it's okay with you, Mr. Chairman, I'm just going to say a few words, and then we have a few folks online to speak in kind of different parts. I just want to thank Senator Hatchett, obviously, for his leadership on this bill. By the way, my name is Brian Hudson. I represent the Georgia Recyclers Association. We have members from large recyclers to small recyclers all over the state of Georgia. So this is Senate Bill 591 is certainly a critical piece as it relates to just reducing some of the burdens that the small recyclers have in Georgia. And we're going to call on one of them in a minute, and she can introduce herself. But I just want to kind of reiterate what Senator Hatchett said on this bill. So, and I'm only going to speak to the cash piece, Mr. Chairman, if that's okay. So on the cash piece, as Senator Hatchett said, we basically met with everybody you could possibly imagine at the Capitol to just kind of make sure that we are accommodating folks and not folks, but accommodating those those types of metals that are being stolen more frequently. Obviously, our goal as recyclers is not to increase metal theft. We have worked with law enforcement. We have worked with a lot of our stakeholders to make sure that metal theft stays where it is, which is low. We want to maintain that. We don't want to do anything that tries to reverse any part of that. And so I just want to be clear about that. But as Senator Hatchett said, we're excluding catalytic converters and air conditioning coils. Those are obviously two very hot items. Air conditioning coils obviously could destroy a home. It could destroy a church as it relates to just the expense relating to maybe a minimum amount of metal as far as the cash or even a check, but then cost thousands of dollars to replace an air conditioning unit in a church or a building or anywhere. So we were very sensitive to that and wanted to make sure that was excluded. We also excluded utility wire, and we defined that in the bill. Communications copper also defined, copper wire, and then batteries. We added batteries back in 2015 to the regulated metal statute because there was an increase in battery theft on farms across the state. And so we worked with the Georgia Farm Bureau and others to add that to the regulated piece to make it more difficult to sell batteries. And that I don't want to speak for them. I know they're in the audience, but I believe that has actually worked pretty well since then. So we wanted to be sensitive to that. And as Senator Hatchett said, with the cash piece, every transaction that will come in will be treated exactly the same that it is now. As Senator Hatchett kind of outlined, they'll have to take their name and address, the purchase transaction date, description, video, et cetera, et cetera. That's all in the law. None of that changes. So every transaction that comes in, the recyclers are going to have to make sure they keep the records on each one of those. There is a provision that was added in the Senate that we support that limits the cash transactions to 2 per day per location. So that means somebody can come into a location 2 times per day and get up $100. Again, every time they come in, all of the records, all of the data will be recorded by the recycler for every time they come in. So that was a change that we thought was a good compromise in that piece. And so unless there's any questions, Mr. Chairman, I'd love to call on Catherine Denny, but I'll obviously entertain any questions from the 2 members.
Chair recognizes Representative McLaurin for a question.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Mr. Hudson. Good to see
Sir.
you.
You too.
I'm going to do that thing where I try to help you do something I don't like. Lines 254.
We've been there before.
We sure have. Lines 254, 255 is, I think, the operative provision you're talking about, right? That's like, limited to 2 transactions per seller per day.
Correct.
I'm wondering if that provision is written in a way to achieve the effect you're looking for, because, my concern is that the limitation more than 100 is what could be read as limited. that it sounds counterintuitive, but that like the cap is what's limited. So you might want clearer language there that says that a seller is limited to 2 transactions per day and not. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
right?
that's a very good point.
Okay, that's all.
Yeah, that's a good point.
All I got
Thank
for
you.
right now. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
So with that, Mr. Hudson, if you can recognize your speaker. And
Yes. Catherine Denny, are you available? Let me make sure you're off mute here.
Hey, can y'all hear me?
Yeah, we
Yes,
can.
ma'am. Welcome.
Hey, awesome. Well, thank you, Brian and Senator Hatchett, for bringing us all together and kind of culminating. My name is Catherine Denny. I'm with SLM Recycling. It is my family's owned and operated business. We're out of Carrollton, Georgia, which is about an hour west of Atlanta. I work with my father, my grandfather, and now my brother. So it truly is a family-owned and operated company. And what I'm going to be focusing on is the cash bit of this bill, and just kind of to express to y'all how the lack of a cash allowance in the state of Georgia is putting undue administrative and monetary burdens on all scrapyards, but particularly scrapyards such as myself, who are smaller, one location, and kind of how that works out. So just to give you an idea, in 2021, SLM Recycling wrote 35,233 checks. 17,998 of those were under $100. So with those checks, we have to do daily positive pay. We have to constantly be fighting fraud. That was a big part of my week last week. We have to have the associated software to catch criminals, to document all of their information. And we also have to have programming necessities. If one of our check printers goes down, it is an absolute and utter nightmare, especially if I'm not there, because my father is not technically sound. He will just start handwriting checks, and it backs up pretty quick. So we're looking at kind of about $50,000 annually costs that we are taking on because of these checks. And so the big question that we have is, for what purpose? And the general consensus is that it's to fight crime, it's to prevent theft, which is absolutely important, something that we deal with weekly, monthly. And so we have a very good working relationship with our local sheriff's office. And when this bill came across, my father and I immediately called him and asked him, hey, this is something that's come across our desk. It's something that we're interested in pursuing. Is this going to impact your job? Is this going to impact our local community? Is this going to impact Carroll County in any way, shape, or form in terms of catching the bad guys? And he immediately said, absolutely not. With all of the information that we have to have, writing a check in no way, shape, or form inhibits local officers from performing their duties and catching the bad guys. So that software, we take vehicle description, copy of their ID. We have images of the scrap. So when we hit read scale on our software, it takes a picture of our scale and what we're purchasing. There's a picture of them signing their name for when we get paid. We have timestamps. We have pretty much everything you could think of, except for maybe their social security number. So that piece really kind of makes the whole check writing to catch bad guys kind of null and void, which also makes us spending $50,000 annually kind of null and void as well. So I'm really excited about this bill. I think it would really impact my operation as well as operations around the state of Georgia. And that's kind of all I have for y'all. Am I taking questions? Is that yes? If y'all have any questions, and y'all might want to speak up just a little bit because it was kind of hard to hear y'all earlier. But that's my spiel.
Thank you. Great presentation. Any questions, members of the committee? Chair recognizes Representative McLaurin for a question.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your testimony. You were saying that you deal with theft on a fairly regular basis, but we've also heard today that theft is at a low and that some of these administrative requirements have helped to curb theft. Can you kind of tell me a sense of how low it actually is? I mean, is there a way we can quantify it or get sort of an exact sense of how bad the problem is? Because I want to, for me, just to sort of show my hand to everybody, I mean, I think one of the things I'm going to be concerned about with this bill is proportionality and making sure that we're not adding new crimes, doing unnecessary, redundant lawmaking if the problem is already pretty low. And so that gives you a sense of why I'm asking. Is there a way you can kind of nail down how bad the problem is? I think you might be muted. Somebody. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I think we can hear you now.
So your question is sort of how often do I deal with metal theft on weekly, monthly basis?
Sure, and yeah, right. And if there's a dollar value, that would be great too.
Okay, a dollar value of like cost we are incurring, or dollar value of how much is being stolen?
Sure, I think how much is being stolen, right?
How much is being stolen? Well, not much, because with what we have, we're able to catch them a lot quicker than, say 50 years ago. So really a lot of, and this bill, what it's doing is
You're buffering. We can't hear you right now. We're going to give you we'll stand by for a moment.
And goods that we then have to either take a loss for or anything like that. So that's another reason, and we'll speak more to the theft aspect of it here in a moment. But that's also why this bill is really strong for law enforcement and for scrap metal processors in the state of Georgia. Did that answer your question? I'm not sure about an exact number. I would have to look back at some of our data from 2021, but I can't see who's talking. So if you want me to get you that information, I'd be more than happy to.
No, I appreciate it. There's only a couple of us in here. So yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to get a sense of generally, what is the problem? How big is it? What's the scope? Because that's going to inform what we need to do as far as the solution is concerned. So thank you.
So this is Chairman Setzler. So generally speaking, since 2012, what the legislature put in place in terms of the photographs and all the documentation, that's made a big dent in metal theft, it sounded like, correct? It's just the check is not adding any value to that. It's creating just another administrative burden. That's the essence of what you're saying.
Absolutely. And it's check fraud in general. So for example, we had last week, we bought some scrap from an individual, what we call peddlers, so somebody who's like a licensed business. They're just bringing in some scrap. We cut this person 2 checks. They changed the number on it, and it turned into $20,000, which was about $200 to begin with. Luckily, we caught it, but due to all the work we have to go through on a daily basis to monitor all the checks that we do. A few weeks ago, we had a check stolen for $130,000. Luckily, that one was also caught. But again, this is like several hours out of my day and my team's day. And so if it was that the questions you're asking, there's kind of two people. There's like the theft part, and then there's the cash part. And both of them have associated costs for scrap metal processors. That makes sense.
Gotcha. Thank you. Appreciate your presentation. If you could stand by, we may need to ask a question of you later. Something may come up. Are you able to stay with us for the rest of the?
So I can swivel in and out as needed.
Super. Thank you. So with that, Senator Hatchett, anything else you'd like to make in your presentation before we recognize our sign-up list?
We have one more witness, Derek Corbett, who is going to come and speak about the catalytic converter piece in this bill.
Okay, Mr. Corbett.
He's actually on Zoom, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, he's on Zoom as well.
Sorry.
There he is. Mr. Corbett, welcome.
Glad to be here, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having me. Brian and Senator Hatchett, thank you for doing such a great job moving this far. I work for Pull Apart. Pull Apart is the largest privately owned auto recycler in the country. We have yards all over the Southeast and the Midwest, all the way out to Arizona. And so we're really proud of the work that we do as auto recyclers, taking those big hunking pieces of metal and bringing them out of the flow and turning them back into usable products. We're putting them as parts back out on the roads to extend their lives. Two ways that we make money. One is used auto parts, and the other is recycle the recycled value of the commodities that are in these vehicles. So catalytic converters, very specifically, are a valuable commodity for Pull Apart. We don't buy detached catalytic converters. We never have. We purchase whole vehicles and we harvest the catalytic converters off of those vehicles. I like to point that out because I think that's important. Also, I like to point out that the catalytic converters that we harvest off the vehicles are not sold as auto parts, because that's really not a legitimate business. It can be, but it's not. And so the value of these catalytic converters is as recycled materials. The rhodium, the palladium, the platinum that's inside of these are high value metals. And so the value of a detached catalytic converter is as a recycled piece of metal. So the spike in catalytic converter theft really hits the bottom line of our business and businesses like ours, the frontline harvesters of these commodities. And it has been our mission over the last year to try and tighten up legislation around the country so that we can start buying more cars with catalytic converters on. There's one of two things that is happening to us today. We're either buying cars that have had the converters stolen off of them, or we're having catalytic converters stolen from us out of our yards. And both are problems that we try to solve. So when we looked at what to do early last year, we took Georgia's metal theft laws as a foundation of where to start, because really Georgia has the most robust metal theft laws in the country. And we started applying those principles to legislation around the country and had real success, early on. Specifically in Tennessee and South Carolina, we were able to pass legislation that is yielding tangible results already today. So we took these metal theft laws from Georgia and we added a few components. These components that we added, that we worked into these pieces of legislation, came from law enforcement. What we did was work with our law enforcement partners in every jurisdiction that we do business to talk about, what do you need? Catalytic converter theft is on the rise. I know you want to stop it as law enforcement. What do you need? And the list of needs was big. It was more bandwidth, more money, more people, more technology, more access to data. But then another need, one that was more immediately solvable, was clarity. it is very difficult for us to investigate and prosecute catalytic converter theft because it's a very white collar type of crime. It takes a lot of money and manpower to investigate it. And it's a very in-depth and thorough investigation. And so that was a problem. So what we did was try to come up with some concepts that would establish that clarity for law enforcement and for prosecutors. And so what we have come up with is what you see in this bill from Senator Hatchett. So it's 4 main points that are intended to bolster Georgia's metal theft laws and create clarity for law enforcement, for those boots on the ground that are out there trying to investigate and prosecute these crimes. So first tenet is to limit the purchase of catalytic converters, used detached catalytic converters, to only secondary metals recyclers. There are some caveats in that bill, and one of them is to say we're going to limit the purchase point of this commodity to secondary metals recyclers, because that's really the only place where this commodity has value. And so I think that's an important tenet to start on, and I'm glad to see it in there. Number 2 is verbiage that says we're going to stop the advertising and the solicit to purchase of used detached catalytic converters. It's a huge problem in our industry, and it's one that it's not only a place for thieves to sell their wares, but it is a motivator for thieves to go out and steal. If you go on Facebook right now and Google used detached catalytic converter, you're going to find some company that's not a legitimate operator. Some might be, but most are not, who say, hey, we're going to be in your neighborhood next week, popped up a tent in Walmart, and you can come sell me your used detached catalytic converter. There's really not a whole lot of used detached catalytic converter demand unless you tell people you're going to pop a tent up in the city of Beaufort, and then you're going to see the catalytic converter crimes spike tremendously popped up. So when we say, unless you are a legitimate purchaser, you are not allowed to advertise. But 2, we give law enforcement a tool to show up at Walmart when Sandy's used catalytic converter purchases comes to town from California, and put the cuffs on them and take them to jail, because they're not supposed to be doing that. Number 3, we very clearly define who is to be in possession of used detached catalytic converters. There are very few reasons to cut a catalytic converter off a car. There's even fewer reasons for Joe Schmo to cut a catalytic converter off a car. And a big problem that law enforcement has across the country, and it's one that we all ought to want to solve, is that when the patrolman pulls a car over, he lacks clarity on what this commodity is, what this item is, and how is interpreted. So we say in this legislation, you have to be a used car parts dealer. You've got to be a newer used car salesman. You have to be an auto dismantler. You have to be mechanic or an auto repairer, someone who should reasonably be in possession of this commodity. And not only that, you have to be able to produce a license and a permit so that law enforcement can look at it and say, okay, this is reasonable and this is acceptable. So it creates clarity. I do believe, especially after being at IATI events across the country and talking to auto theft investigators, it is a really difficult position to put these guys in, where the law is not as clear as it can be. And so when they get to a situation where they have to make a judgment call, they don't have the tools that they feel that they need. This is an important tool for law enforcement to have clarity when they pull a car over and find 15 detached catalytic converters in the trunk. Last tenet that I want to talk about is there's a verbiage in the bill that says, hey, if you are in possession of a used detached catalytic converter, you are assumed to be in possession of contraband. This is another tool for law enforcement. Oftentimes, when you pull someone over with a used detached catalytic converter in the back, they can say, "Hey, I found it in a ditch. Now it's mine. I cut it off my car last week, and I've still got it in the back seat." There's any number of excuses or reasons that someone can give, and 1 out of 100 might be legitimate. But it's unfair to put our officers in a place where they have to decide whether or not the possession is legitimate. So by labeling these detached catalytic converters as contraband, we empower these officers to take these products, which are more than likely stolen, and hold them until they've had the time and the help to sort out whatever's going on with the situation that they have found themselves in.
Okay.
So I've
Mr. Corbett,
seen these tenets applied to legislation in Tennessee and South Carolina. I have seen the number of catalytic converters that we harvest go up. I have seen the number of arrests go up. So I'm really a believer that these are good additions to what's already a strong metal theft foundation in the state of Georgia. So
thank you, Mr.
happy to
Corbett.
answer questions, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Any questions from members of the committee? Mr. Corbett, I've got a question for you, and we're going to take a deeper dive into this as we go. What other items I know with respect to illegal drugs and those kinds of things, possession of those, they're illegal to use, they're illegal to possess. I'll turn the volume up a little bit. What other items are otherwise legal items that are illegal to possess? I mean, I can have a catalytic converter on my car and drive around with it, but I'm not able to have it in the trunk of my car. What other items fall into that category, to your knowledge?
Oh, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if there is another item that is legal to possess. Drugs would be the only thing that I can think of, right? If you have a pill box that's full of I don't take any medicine. What's one that you can get with a prescription that's oxycodone? If you got a pill box that's full of oxycodone, but you don't have a prescription, it's not labeled, you might have it legitimately, but an officer is going to seize it because it's considered contraband. But it could very well be something that you have obtained legally. That's the only thing I can think of off the top of my head that would be comparable. Someone has handed me a note here that's not legible. So I'm gonna have to skip that. I can read the word individual, but I can't read any of the other ones.
It's all good. I wanted to kind of frame the question. I know that's something that I've thought about as I've studied the bill, and folks have brought to me, and we need to be thoughtful. You've got the act, but do you have an intent? And I know it's difficult when you've got a person driving around with a pickup truck with 25 catalytic converters in the back. I know it certainly raises awareness, certainly might raise suspicion. And I know intent's sometimes hard to prove, but we also need to be mindful of this, how this lives within our existing legal framework of usually having an act and intent to be a crime. And with that, I'll recognize Representative McLaurin.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your testimony. The sense I get is what you're saying is there's no legitimate public policy reason for a person who's not licensed in some way to be in possession of any used detached catalytic converter. Is that basically right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I mean, because, yeah, we have this idea of contraband, right? That, there's some property that you just don't have a property interest in because for whatever reason, if it's, if the only legitimate usage would be to make money off of it and, the presumption is that it's stolen. I mean, I think it's a rare designation to give a type of property, but I can see the logic behind saying that that it should be categorically excluded from, legitimate property that people can own. I guess, sort of where I want to meet in the middle on this, again, if I can show my cards, is like, if we're going to make that designation, which I think is a big step, then I think we maybe pare down some of this back end, what I would consider to be optics type provisions in this bill that essentially are saying, well, we don't want to communicate the message that we're soft on this, right? So we need to like beef up the already very successful metal law somehow, right? So I think what I'm getting at ultimately is I think that one can think that there's a legitimate policy concern here and want to restrict the ability of, you know, folks who are not licensed to have these things, but let's be realistic about what our administrative restraints are already doing for us, right?
Question for you of my own. What's the street value of a catalytic converter? And I don't know if catalytic converters are particularly lucrative off of Ford F-150 pickup trucks, and they're not off of other vehicles. I don't have a sense of that. What's a good walking around number for street value today of a catalytic converter in Carrollton, Georgia, for example?
So the legitimate value is the legitimate value. I don't know what the street's paying. And so the legitimate value of a catalytic converter is roughly $150 per pound of substrate that is found inside the can. So the three valuable metals inside a catalytic converter are palladium, rhodium, and platinum. And there's usually about 2 to 2.5 pounds. 2.5 pounds would be your high value catalytic converters like a Subaru or a Ford F-150, those that burn really clean. Most are closer to 2 or 1.8 pounds of substrate per can. So $150 per pound of substrate is about how you calculate the value of a catalytic converter. So roughly $280 to $300.
Okay, thank you for that. Any more questions, and Mr. Corbett? We are going to have to manage time, so I'm going to need to cut you off here. Any last closing words for us?
From me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate you guys putting so much thought and effort into this. Last visit I had with the Georgia Association of Chiefs of Police was last month at their convention teaching a metal theft class. And these are guys who are believers in what they're doing, but are unaware of the legal framework that's at their fingertips. But when we got into the gritty and with this effort that we had on the table, they all agreed to a man, hey, this would help us very, very much. And so I know that they support this legislation as a tool to increase their ability to catch and throw in jail. So thank you for your time, and I'll be here as long as you need me. And I'll be here post-hearing if you need me then too.
Super. Thanks for your presentation. Senator Hatch, if you want to stand by, I'm going to recognize some other folks. If you can be close by here. This is a subcommittee. We'll be a little more informal. So if you want to grab a seat, we can call on you perhaps if we need to. With that, we're going to move forward and recognize our sign-up list. Mr. Robert Smith from Prosecuting Attorney's Council. Mr. Smith.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not here to speak on this bill. I'm here to speak on the other bill.
I see that. Okay. Ms. Travis from Gactel. Ms. Travis, welcome back.
It's nice to be here. Although I don't love this room, to tell you the truth. Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Jill Travis. I'm the Executive Director of the Georgia Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. Golly, I got all the way up here and didn't bring what I was wanting to bring.
Take your time.
Yeah.
This is a subcommittee. We can do these things, right? We don't have to be all polished. In the meantime, Representative McClellan's going to make a monologue for us.
I was going to vamp a little bit, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I heard, I wasn't here for it, but I heard that, you mentioned a few of your colleagues from Judiciary Non-Civil you enjoyed working with, and I just want to say I'm honored, to be included in that list, Mr. Chairman.
And another one that was a stalwart member is here. Former Leader Trammell's with us. Welcome back.
Can we give it up for former Leader Trammell? Former member of the committee?
I cannot tell you how many hours where it was myself and Leader Trammell. Actually, before he was Leader Trammell. When he became Leader Trammell, his attendance was a little more spotty, but before then he was He was a great member of our
Well,
subcommittee.
there's nothing quite as comforting as knowing you're going to spend 2 hours solo with Ed Setzler
Roger that.
talking about anything.
Just doesn't get any better than this. Ms. Travis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The main concern, there's a few concerns we have about this bill. Let me talk specifically about the forfeiture provision, and that is found in the bill, page 13, at section 1-7 of the bill. You know how it is this time of session where it's like everything seems to look familiar? Well, because it is. This concept of the catalytic converters was heard in, I think it was House Motor Vehicles or Transportation or something like that, in a bill labeled House Bill 1528. And we can appreciate the sense that the desire of the author is to forfeit a vehicle that's used in transportation. We like the language that's in House Bill 1528 a lot better. It's section 6 of that bill, and it requires that there's a conviction and a stay of the forfeiture proceedings. And so we would ask the committee to consider revising section 1-7 of this bill, 591, to match section 6 of House Bill 1528. It also, the House bill updates the cross-references to the Civil Asset Forfeiture Chapter. So while you're there, doing a little fixing, we'd ask for that to be considered. Also wanted to raise a question with respect to...
Ms. Travis, before you move on from forfeiture, do you have any concerns from a forfeiture perspective on the issue of proportionality? I mean, I know the courts have spoken to this in the somewhat recent past with respect to small penalties, but the forfeiture asset, the forfeited asset is perhaps significantly beyond the value of what would otherwise be a criminal penalty. Do you see a conflict in any way as a result of that?
I do.
So, I mean, and again, I think from a misdemeanor perspective, we've got limits there. I don't know if we should specify limits, or I think in the high and aggregate misdemeanor perspective, I think we're looking at $5,000 generally there, conventionally within Georgia law. I think if we're talking about garden variety misdemeanors, it's much lower. Perhaps the chair's vehicle is the only vehicle that fall under the $1,000 limit for street value. But I want to make sure that if we're going to do this and we're going to move forward with a forfeiture structure, that you and everybody here help us think through what a good response is. We're not here to send a message. We're here to draw good laws that we can actually live by, right? And if we see an interest in forfeiture being part of the picture, then we want to make the picture clear and appropriate. That's,
And I think the step in the right direction is to go to the model of having a conviction and staying the proceedings. And that gets us a lot closer to, that still doesn't talk about the Eighth Amendment specifically, but I think it gets us going in the right direction.
okay. Representative McLaurin, question.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I shockingly agree with what Ms. Travis just said, but also my biggest concern with forfeiture right now is that any car involved in transporting these things. I mean, it's one thing to say that we think categorically there's no legitimate interest that an individual might have in holding or having one of these things, possessing. For me, it's a bridge too far to say that any car used to transport any of them is subject to the same forfeiture rule. I mean, it's, we talk about this with like street racing and other policy contexts as well. It's a big deal to take somebody's car, and to tie that up with, something that's where the public policy interest is maybe one stone's throw away, i.e. specifically these converters. I just think we need to exercise the maximum possible scrutiny and care in having a provision like that. So I'm going to be opposed to any forfeiture provision that has the car wrapped up in it, unless there is some sort of criminal conviction, to Ms. Travis's point, that is specific to the use of the car, in which case I could understand forfeiture in that case, because that's what we do with criminal forfeiture all the time. But I just wanted to kind of make that point while we're talking about it.
And I would just say this. I mean, I think there's perhaps an appropriate context for forfeiture. We all may draw the line differently. I think, as a member of the committee thinking through this, when we lower the threshold of a crime to the mere possession of wire or a catalytic converter, there's not this intent component to it. And then we're also bringing in forfeiture as part of that. We've lowered the bar for that which is a crime, and then forfeiture is part. So, I mean, all of these things relate to each other. I'm not trying to prejudge where I am or where we should be, but I do think if this is going to be a crime and vehicles are used as part of it, then I don't know why this should be separate from how forfeiture might be used in other contexts. I don't know why we would keep this from being subject to forfeiture. But we also need to be mindful of the thresholds we're creating and what the second and third order effects would be. So, okay.
Yes,
Ms.
please.
Travis. Yeah.
Yes, please. I have to tell you that until the previous speaker was chatting, I had not noticed lines 157 to 161 on page 7 of the bill with this presumption, making it a presumption that if you've got these certain items in your car, it sounds like a presumption of guilt. It says presumption of contraband, and then it goes automatically to forfeiture. I'm not sure how this section of the bill ties to section 1-7 of the bill, but it concerns me because it talks about forfeiture and this presumption. The last time I checked, we were presumed to be innocent until proven guilty. So that's troubling to me.
Well, Ms. Travis, there are some things where this may go back in time. I mean, we've had some, in the last 15 years, we've probably had 2 or 3 bills that have come through this committee that talked about it shall be prima facie evidence. Because of the nature, it kind of shifts the burden a little bit. I think some of this they're trying to do some of this here. That's why I want to study how we're doing this, and is this the best way to do it? Sometimes the way to structure that is to create something that's the elements of a crime, and then have exemptions that are very broad, that you have a lot of off-ramps that keep you from being criminalized. So this is something that, to you and the author, I want to make sure we button this down. But
And I think one of the language tools that I'm thinking of is rebuttable presumption, but this is a presumption. So that's troubling to me, and especially when it connects to forfeiture. And lastly, not completely familiar with this bill, but at line 342, the language says that secondary metal recyclers can only pay by certain means, and they've eliminated cash. And if the desire of the author is to allow cash to be paid, it would seem to me that cash shouldn't be stricken. That's just a former OLC note, not a Gactyl note.
which line is this, Ms. Travis?
342.
342.
That's
Ms.
all I
Ms.
have.
Travis, my guess is in a prior life you had some contact with this 2012 bill. Is that fair to say?
Fair to say.
Yeah. Okay. Appreciate you being with us today. Any more questions for Ms. Travis? Representative McClure.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Travis, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, in terms of the point I was making earlier about this sort of categorical determination that there's no legitimate public policy interest or reason to let an individual just have one of these without being licensed, do you have an objection to that piece of it? This idea that, I mean, I know that there's the sort of technical aspect of we don't want to do the forfeiture part wrong, but in terms of just the isolated question of calling this contraband and saying, as a state of Georgia policy is, there's no legitimate reason for an individual to have one of these things. Is that something that you have a position on or against?
In my mind, nothing should be called contraband unless it actually is contraband, like a drug is contraband. I don't see the point of calling anything contraband that isn't actually, I mean, I'd have to look up the definition, but property used directly or indirectly to commit a crime. When you're driving down the interstate and you've got bales of marijuana in your trunk and they're trying to take your car because it was used, we understand that is something to used and we allow forfeiture in that right now.
And I'm with you on the car. I think what my question is, because we're getting testimony to build a record today that there's really no legitimate reason for somebody to just have a used detached converter. And this is when I put on my moderate Democrat hat, like I'm, maybe ceding that ground, right? So I'm curious whether you have a position as to, I'm just for the fulsomeness of the discussion, in the honor of Mr. Chairman, to have a fulsome discussion. Is there any reason why you would oppose that perspective?
I have to agree with you. I don't know a lot about cars, but I can't imagine other than, it got cut off and it was laying down on the ground when you caught the people in the act, and now you've picked it up and take it to the repair shop to say, can I put it Humpty Dumpty back together again? And if you were stopped on the way and then that presumption applies, then then maybe it's not contraband. I just don't know why we need that label.
So this is actually maybe a good point. That's actually maybe a good carve out that maybe should go in. That it's, if you're in possession of a catalytic converter that previously belonged or was attached to a vehicle you own, and it's for the purpose of repair or for self-help, I assume you'd be amenable to that carve out. So okay.
And Representative McClellan, that's kind of where I was going. Is if we're going to take this premise that the possession of a catalytic converter can, by virtue of having it as a crime, that needs to be broad. But then we have a lot of off ramps that says if it's your own, if you purchased it, if you this, then it gets almost back to this rebuttable presumption thing that Jill. That may be a more elegant way to do it, but we got to sort that out. Okay.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you, Mr. Travis. Appreciate you. Chair recognizes Mr. Scott Turner from Eternal Vigilance Action. Welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor to be back in front of this subcommittee where I have struggled in the past as a former state lawmaker. And this is an issue that I only got involved in because, if you recall, one of the issues I was very passionate about when I was in the legislature was civil asset forfeiture. If this bill didn't have civil asset forfeiture as one of its penalties, I probably would not be standing here talking to you about this bill. So I want to focus in on that. And a little context about my career. Before I became a lawmaker and during my time as a lawmaker, I worked in IT. I worked at Hewlett-Packard for about 10 years, and then I went to work for a couple of different third-party maintainers. Part of my job was to decommission servers and move them around from data center to data center at a large pharmaceutical client in Duluth, and they had their data center in Douglasville at a co-location data center out there. And so I would move their stuff every couple of years from point A to point B. They would end their rental agreement with that colo, and I would move it to another place. And I would carry around the wires and the computers. Now, the language of the bill does say, since I was working in telecom, I would be fine, and I wouldn't necessarily, but I'd have to go and prove that. If a police officer pulled me over, the way civil asset forfeiture works in Georgia is that I would have to go to court under a preponderance of the evidence standard and prove the innocence of the property. And at this point, not necessarily all the property is mine. So that's problematic. The civil asset forfeiture, the most egregious line in all of OCGA, in my opinion, is this one little line that says, even if you're not found not guilty of the crime associated with the forfeiture proceedings, you still do not get your property back. And so we are creating and expanding that with a whole host of new items. Now, I don't necessarily have a problem with the escalating penalties, first offense, misdemeanor, high and aggravated, going to felony, and I think that would be very effective. However, when we worked on this bill in motor vehicles, we did a couple of different things. Number one is we stripped out the wire piece, and this is the reason why. The definition of telecommunication or used telecommunication wire is exactly what I'm holding in my hand. I bought this today at Office Depot in Woodstock on Highway 92. $17 for a 6-foot cable. It's an RG6, which is identical in most respects and undistinguishable for a police officer on the side of the road from any other type of utility grade cable. This actually is used by utility telecoms or to provide that service commonly. Not much difference or any difference at all between this particular cable and what you would see in a data center. It's a coax cable. You're familiar with this. It runs to your cable box if you have a cable box. It runs to your cable modem if you have a cable modem. It's running through your yard if you have cable service. The only difference between under this bill, between this being a legal object in my hand and contraband is whether or not it's in this package. If it's out of this package and it's used, it's contraband. Take my car without a trial, and if I'm found not guilty of the crime later, I still don't get my car back. That's not fair. It's not right. You guys know, but I'm going to say it for the record, about Thames v. Indiana. You all saw me doing a dance on February 19th, 2019. I was still in the legislature then, and I was dancing around saying, we got a big case on civil asset forfeiture. It was 9-0. And basically the case and the fact pattern of Thames v. Indiana was this. A man who dealt heroin out of his $42,000 value Land Rover was arrested in Indiana for dealing heroin. They seized his car. The maximum fine for that crime in Indiana was $10,000. The value of the car was $42,000. And the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that you cannot take property that is in excess value of the maximum fine for the crime. So in this particular case, you do have an issue with proportionality, as mentioned earlier by other folks. I will offer a solution to that. The organization that represented Mr. Timms has offered to assist in developing language that would address the proportionality issue. I'd be happy to supply those resources if you guys desired. So in essence, and in summary, civil asset forfeiture puts the cart before the horse. We have this concept. It's ingrained in us, innocent until proven. You finish that sentence in your head because that's a primary American promise. I didn't have to finish it for you because that's the promise government makes. And this kind of tilts it on its head. If you want to seek harsher penalties, you can do that, but due process needs to be maintained, and that's our stance. So thank you for your time.
Chair recognizes Representative McLaurin for a question.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I mean, the first thing I want to do is just bask in how friendly this conversation is and its constituent members to civil asset forfeiture reform. It's so nice, right? Just being a conversation in this building where you're like, man, we would like to do something about this. I, for one, as half of this subcommittee currently, would love to see those resources and to have a robust conversation involving Ms. Travis and anybody else who's concerned about the forfeiture angle to bring this in line, not just with other legislative measures that we've taken up this year, but also with due process, right? This idea that there's a constitutional infirmity if we leave that door open. So I think that's an excellent point. I know you're not surprised to hear that, but that would be what I would like to do in the off time we have.
I'll be happy to get with you, Representative.
Okay. Representative Turner, appreciate your input. We would like to see those resources. There again, as we talk to the author, there may be some movement on this in directions that I don't want to prejudge. We'll see where that goes. But I think to the extent it's going to be in any bill, whether it's this bill or another metal theft bill that may be moving around, I think that would be helpful to have. I don't know if the underlying asset forfeiture language would be really in play, or if it's going to be limited to this context, but we'd welcome that if you could.
I will be with you as soon as you'd like.
Ms. Turner, welcome back.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
With that, Chair's going to recognize Senator Hatchett to come on back up. Is there anybody else that, but before we recognize the author though, anyone else here to speak to the bill or raise questions, concerns, or input? I see some potential parties that might have interest in this, but they're not wanting to speak at this point. Okay. Right. Senator Hatchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to let you know and other members of the committee know, I have spoken with the gentleman that just previously testified about those concerns, and we actually had an amendment ready to go on the floor that would address that would basically say if you're found with this contraband and if you're found with this contraband, that the assets would not be forfeited until you were actually convicted. So you wouldn't have this presumption in taking prior to a conviction, and we're completely open to that amendment. The other thing, something I also communicated with the previous speakers, it is not our intent for someone to get pulled over or charged because they have a computer cable. I don't know a lot of the terms when it comes to communications, communication wires and cables. I've talked to the EMCs across the state, AT&T. One of their biggest concerns was that in the past they would have people that would actually remove cable from the bottom of a cell phone tower or remove communications table that you see on telephone poles, and that's what they're trying to prevent. We are not trying to make it illegal to carry around a laptop cord. So, I'm open to suggestions, but I've also spoken with the EMCs and AT&T, and they'd be willing to actually drop those type of wires from out of the presumption for civil assets forfeiture if we're not able to come up with a definition that would not that would protect people and make sure they don't get arrested for carrying a laptop cord. I think that was it was made clear that is not the intent of this bill.
I understand, and as you know, we're exploring the boundary conditions. What's the minimal fact pattern, the lightest fact pattern, if you will, that
Right.
could still qualify, that with a straight face you could say this could still put someone in jeopardy. What was the discussion around the qualifications around construction demolition? The people that are doing self-help construction, demolishing homes, renovation, whether you're pulling things out of your yard, whether you're doing something. I had some concerns about that. How do we feel about someone that is going to a C&D landfill that's going to be transporting some of these materials, not for scrap, but just transporting to dump, pay their tonnage and scrap things? I just that came to mind as I was reading through the bill. I don't know if that was wrestled with in the Senate or not.
It was, and if you look on page 3, line 63, and then also on line 68, there's the term there when we're defining used communications copper and used utility wire. It's the commonly used by a lawful provider of communication services, provider for providing communication services, including without limitation utility grade wires or cables, bus bars, and waveguides. With that language, our intent was to specifically tailor the used communications copper and the used utility wire for those wires that you would commonly see on a telephone pole, on a cell phone tower, running from a telephone pole into your house. Those wires that, not just your common wire that you pull out of an electrical outlet if you're flipping a house or something like that. And like I said, I'm not 100% confident in my knowledge on the different types of wires, but the intent of the bill is not to punish someone from, like you said, flipping a house or being in possession of that. The goal of that section is to really, capture the utility grade high voltage type wire, and if we need to go back to the drawing board to make sure we have a specific carve out that's more.
Yes, sir. I was thinking more in lines 154 through 156. If you could go there. You can see the lawful provider of electric communication services on 153 and 154. So the utility or the telecom provider themselves could have these materials. Entity that has a written contract with them. So if there's a builder, constructor doing demolition, somebody that's under contract to do those things. You use the term a licensed contractor,
And that's broad.
It's broad, but I'm just thinking about people that are not licensed contractor, but that are working on their own facilities. They're not licensed. They're just it's a self-help project, a facility maintenance crew that's part of an end user, not part of a telecom provider.
Right.
We need to make sure that those folks aren't getting caught up in this. If they've got more sophisticated in-house capability, they're not a contractor, they're not the utility. I just want to make sure we've thought about this as broadly as we can.
No, I think that's a great point, and I know, my wife and I have flipped several houses, and the demolition part is part where you don't necessarily need a
Right.
license if you're doing it yourself, but then the putting it back together part is where you hire the contractor. So we don't want to capture those people that are doing this, like I said,
Sure.
flipping a house, tearing out wires. I mean, that's not the intent of the bill. So any suggestions, or we're open to language to amend that.
Yeah, or in some cases, an abandoned, some abandoned infrastructure that maybe the previous owner said, telecom providers like, we're not using this anymore. I don't know if it's a tower or whatever, but it's something. you buy it, you're a new owner, you sort of inherit this thing. Oh, I don't need this anymore. You might have stuff residual laying around that you decide to tear out at some point as part of a project. I mean, we have to think through this. I mean, just as we are reminded that 10.8 million people is a lot of folks, and these things actually pop up more frequently than you think. So just want to explore that with you as we take a deeper dive in this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And one of the previous speakers also brought up Section 2, that the cash piece was actually stricken out. That's actually the sunset provision. So on July of 2025, that Section 2 would go into effect if we didn't repeal the sunset. So that's why that section's in there.
Okay. Chair recognizes Representative McLaurin for a question.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the explanations and amenability. I mean, so I'm not somebody who passes a lot of bills, right? So I can't, in my bones, I can't relate to the frustration of passing a perfectly good bill out of an entire chamber and then coming to this subcommittee and, having to deal with us. But so I'm grateful for that. But I guess my question is, in terms of the definitions, if we're trying to nail down like what's going on with, people who are taking wires or the contraband that the bill's trying to expand to include, who are these folks exactly? I mean, we got some testimony about catalytic converters, but I'm trying to figure out in your modal or average scenario, somebody's got wire in a truck that they stripped out of an actual utility setup infrastructure somewhere. Who are those folks? How do they do it? What's the MO? Because I guess to me that would be an important consideration in deciding how to narrow this, to try to define the conduct specifically, because I think we're all kind of in agreement that we're not in a great place if we're defining wire so broadly that it includes, what former Rep. Turner so ably demonstrated with his prop. But I think, we've obviously got to get to some narrower place. I think it'd be helpful to know, if the MO is that somebody goes to a specific type of infrastructure and takes a specific type of wire, that's going to be helpful in maybe getting it down.
Yeah, and I guess the intent was to crack down on that wire, which is commonly used at the bottom of the cell phone tower or between the telephone poles. It's also, you want to make it a deterrent for people, because there's actually, I was speaking with someone earlier in the session where someone tried to remove copper wire from the bottom of a cell phone tower and actually was electrocuted because they didn't do it properly. So there's also that public safety concern there too, where you don't want people to be allowed to be in possession of those things unless they are licensed. Now, because of my ignorance with the different types of copper wire, I'm not going to be able to come up with that definition. However, moving forward, a suggestion to the committee would be to remove if we're unable to come up with that a definition that suits all the parties, remove the copper wire from the civil asset forfeiture, but it's going to be very important to keep it with regard to the cash piece. That's something that we would really want to make sure that you still can't get cash for copper communications or utility wire. I think that's very important.
So, and as I've said earlier in the hearing today, my preference is for that type of administrative check, right? If we have administrative rules that keep people from having incentives to do this stuff, then great. Let me ask you this. Would you be open to a narrowing of those definitions that basically require the contraband to be actually employed by utilities? So I get that there might be a proof concern that prosecutors would have that, okay, if somebody's got a bunch of wire that, again, is commonly used in the back of their truck, how do you prove that it actually came from a place where it was in service employed? I could see how that would be a potential proof problem. But I guess my thought would be, if we're really going to be fair about this and not have too broad of a sweep, from a liberty perspective, right, I would want to err on the side of overly narrow than overly broad. And so I guess my question would be, wouldn't it make sense intuitively to make a requirement of the contraband definition be that whatever wire is not just the type that's normally used, right, to your point, but that it was actually employed by a utility in practice, right? Or that it was in the possession of the utility to be deployed, basically, that it was property that belonged to the utility. Because to me, that's the only way that it would legitimately be contraband. And that's the kind of theft I think we're talking about, right? Is we're talking about folks who are stripping wire from actually used wires utilities. I'm
Yeah, no,
brainstorming, but
I understand the policy behind that. The only thing that gives me a little bit of pause is when you pull someone over and they have this utility grade cable in the back of their pickup truck and they have no lawful reason to have it. I don't know how an officer on the side of the road would be able to know whether or not it was employed or whether or not it was actually used at the bottom of a tower. I mean,
So to Ms. Travis's point, just floating something here. What if we started with a rebuttable presumption that possession meant it was contraband or unlawful use, and then you give somebody the ability in a proceeding to prove by a preponderance an affirmative defense that they were using it for some lawful purpose. I mean, and that's just, we have other types of statutes, I think, that work that way. And again, it would, would still leave former Rep. Turner with the problem that if he just had his cable, he'd have to go somewhere and prove that he had a legitimate use for it. But at the very least, we'd be narrowing the ultimate definition of contraband down to something that is what we were actually targeting. It's just a thought. And I know today's we're just kind of taking the temperature, but.
I mean, I can say as a member of the committee, and I'm not speaking my chair role, I have a real issue with a per se crime. I have it in my position. I therefore have committed a crime. I have a real issue with that, just policy-wise. And I think rebuttable presumption moves it in the other direction. Maybe it's not far enough. We could debate that, but I sense among our members that a per se crime is going to be an issue on that front. I'm just for what it's worth. I'm just throwing that out there. Just having a sense of our committee, and I don't think that's there's parts of your bill that are core parts of your bill. I don't see how that really has any connection as such to the payments piece. I mean, there's a lot of components to this bill, and they're all related in terms of their scrap metal. But I don't want to, as I work with you as author and Chairman Burchett as a committee,
right.
Want to make sure we kind of rack and stack your priorities, and you're not in a place where the perfect is the enemy of good, or very good and important.
Right.
But I do see an issue there is this per se crime. I think that may have some issues with that.
Right. And from I guess a constitutionality standpoint, I would never want to shift the burden onto a defendant. Especially, I mean, in the United States, you are, innocent until proven guilty. I think the sentiment or the I guess intent of that language was to capture things that no one, unless they worked in the field or were a licensed contractor or something, would actually have a lawful reason to be, I guess, in possession of those items. And with the catalytic converter piece, in particular, that's a big issue that we're trying to attack with this piece of legislation as well. So, I'm obviously open to suggestions and want to talk because I like I said, I don't want somebody to get pulled over and have any assets seized because they have a laptop cable.
Let me ask you a question. Anything else, Representative McClure, of the author? On lines 296 and 297, section 1.6. And Ms. Travis may actually provide some feedback for us here. I recall, and you've been down here long enough to see that sometimes you pass something that you worked on in the Senate, it comes to the House, there's a change, it comes back in conference, and sometimes you lose track of exactly where it landed when all the dust settled. I would say, and I'm just sort of speaking parenthetically here as one approach to this, as we think about criminalizing the per se possession versus these acts and creating this environment of deterrence. I was of the belief that when we dealt with this years ago, we actually took this $1,500 value, this damage value, that's right now for a third subsequent offense, when such regulated metal property is unlawfully obtained and results in property damage exceeding $1,500, that's the felony threshold in these contexts, that it's a felony. I thought we applied that way before for third offense. I thought that was more broadly applied. Jill?
It's 500
Today. So you'd be raising it.
I thought it was 500 in like a retail setting, but I thought it was 5 in some places and 1,500 in others. Is that right?
16,723.
Okay.
Criminal damage to property in the second degree.
So that's a 500 threshold then?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So stepping back from that, I mean, philosophically.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. Is that just the damage to the property or the value of the contraband?
It's
So
damage
this
property.
would be the value of that what you have in your possession. It's different. Because you might have $1,500 worth of cable, but the damage you cause, or $500, $400 worth of cable, but the damage you cause of the cell phone towers $20,000.
Bingo. And I think that's one of the beauties of this approach is I had a friend of mine who has a well. He has a farm out in Gordon County, and they for 75 cents of copper wire, they destroyed a $2,000 well pump.
Right.
So I am very friendly to the $2,000 damage value, moving from third offense forward to first or second offense. I think there's a lot of deterrent value in that. When folks that are ripping copper off and ripping stealing wire, when they think about the irretrievable value of the end item, whether it's HVAC coils or otherwise, $8,008 HVAC system for $20 in coils. I mean, I think there's a lot of value to take that approach. Mm-hmm. I was shocked that it's just third offense. I thought we moved that. I thought from a first offense perspective, we had done something there back in 2012. So.
Well, I think the or there for a third or subsequent offense, or when such regulated metal property is unlawfully obtained and results in property damage exceed $1,500. I mean, you could get that on the first offense if it exceeds $1,500.
Okay.
It's just that or. It's a big or. It is.
To the gentleman, thank you. I didn't read it that way. It's good. This jives with my understanding of what we did back in 12. It was a first offense. You get the felony hammer if it's more than $1,500 in value, which is this is a potent deterrent.
And to the chairman's point, if the law is $500, we obviously don't want to raise it.
Yeah.
So if it's determined that code section is $500, it was just in the Senate committee. So originally the bill was written with $3,000. In the Senate committee, it was brought up. An amendment was made by Chairman Harper to make it $1,500, and that was supposed to comply with the felony statutes that we have. If there's a different one, we're obviously not going to.
I think there was some discussion around it's $500. I mean, you damaged my iPhone. I was running with an iPhone 5 until pretty recently. My daughter may be upgraded with 13. This 13 is more than a $500 item. So you damage my iPhone, then it would be a felony. I don't know that 500 property damage is necessarily the felony threshold. That's where we have to really wrestle with that. So I'm not going to prejudge that. I mean, if 15 is somewhere in code today, I don't know. But I do think if we create this damage factor that's available at first offense, I think we're creating some very strong deterrents without having a per se crime just for the possession of something. I get the suspicion that it arises, that comes from that. And we're not going to prejudge. We're not voting today. I just wanted to. I think if this applies at first offense, I think we have a very strong hammer we're bringing into play with what we've done here, without civil asset forfeiture, without a per se possession equals crime framework. So, last question is Representative McLaurin.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, just on this subject, though, I mean, I think we should be clear that this is creating a new offense that would be stacked onto a criminal damage to property offense, right? So, the idea that the 500 number has to be the same here just because they're similar concepts. I mean, I think there are multiple offenses, right? You could charge somebody with criminal damage and also charge them with this. And so, to me, the idea that we're like, it's not like we're raising it to 1,500 if we do this. We're just saying that would be the threshold for stacking this additional offense. I'd note further that, all the testimony today has been that theft of this nature, when you have administrative requirements, is largely kept in check. And I would always question, as I do on the House floor, what stacking offenses gets us appreciably, demonstrably, if, we already have a felony deterrent for damage over $500, right? So it could be, I'm willing to accept maybe this like realist view that the traffic generated in the General Assembly and potentially news media amplifying that we're thinking about this is something that helps with the deterrent, because then it's in the public view or narrative, that, oh, look, we're cracking down. But apart from that kind of news hit, it's totally unclear to me how stacking these offenses reaches the average person who, I'd like to imagine a group of guys talking about stealing catalytic converters, and one of them's like, well, that Senate bill just passed, and they could have already charged you with a felony and pled you down to a misdemeanor, but now they're going to charge you with 2 felonies and plead you down to who knows what. So, if that's how it really works, that fine.
I think
but
that is how it works.
well, listen, I'll change my whole approach to this committee if somebody can show me like a, Veritas project video of guys talking about stealing catalytic converters, and boy, we're look at us, how deterred we are. But I think in general, we just have to be circumspect about that. And so, I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. And to the author, I'll give you the last word.
Well, I just thank you, and if it helps the committee, we had an amendment that was ready to go on the floor. We just couldn't get it done in time. That I think would address the civil asset forfeiture from, being able to seize prior to conviction. I can supply that, but also if there's any other resources that you need from me, I'm happy to give those to you.
So putting you on the spot to kind of characterize the components of the bill, we've got the payment piece in the circumstances that it's limited to, opening up $100 cash payments as a payment component. You've got the component of this per se crime for possession of utility wire and other things. There's the civil asset forfeiture component to this that's part of this bill. There's the sunset piece we've got to address, and there's some other maybe smaller provisions or anything else that's sort of a headline provision of this.
I think just to keep in mind, if you are going to mess with the definitions or change the definitions of utility wire or communications copper or anything like that, just to make sure that whatever happens, we keep the carve out for cash. We keep the catalytic converters, air conditioning coils, and communications copper wire. Preclude anyone from being able to get cash for those type of things. And then when it comes to the civil asset forfeiture, if we need to drop that communications copper because we may be unable to write a definition that doesn't capture the laptop cable, I just want to keep that carve out for the cash.
My sense is that we leave the definitions alone because the definitions are needed for other parts of the bill.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you're going to have carve outs of what doesn't apply, you do that in and around the offense itself, not in the definitions.
Okay.
That's my sense, but we can work through that. But with that, I have 10 minutes till 3. We're not going to take up 328 today. If there are some suggestions about it or any input, come see me. I'll stick around after the meeting and have those conversations. With that, we stand adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.